Thank you for tuning in to Foreign Correspondents. I'm Min San-hee with our group of foreign journalists. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
The news of impeachment made headlines last week, and I understand you all covered the story. Frank, we'll start with you. What was the focus of your coverage?
Well, the focus of my coverage actually was the demonstrations going on outside of the Constitutional Court. I wandered into the pro-Park demonstrators prior to the announcement and took some video there. And then when the announcement was taking place, I moved into the pro-impeachment area of demonstrators and recorded what went on there. It was a very interesting historic time for South Korea, certainly.
Right. Elise, what about you?
Well, this was a huge story globally. The interest of our American audiences was really just that a leader could be impeached at all, because a lot of commenters in the U.S. were talking of the same thing, about hoping that something like this could happen in the U.S. with regard to the American president. And so just the sort of resiliency of the South Korean democracy, not only to go through the process and impeach at the legislative level, but then also have the courts uphold that ruling.
Right.
Yeah, I was at the press center most of the day, busy day for all journalists in Seoul, I think, and I was mostly covering what would happen next. So what's the next president? What kind of policies is he going to bring forward? Or what changes are we going to see in South Korean society after the impeachment?
Right, and we'll talk more on that. But first, former President Park Geun-hye was impeached last week, becoming the first democratically elected Korean leader to be ousted from her post. We have details of the impeachment in our first report, as well as the response from the public here and from the international media. At 11 a.m. on March 10th, an unprecedented event in Korea's history took place.
피청구인 대통령 박근혜를 파면한다.
The Constitutional Court removed President Park Geun-hye from office 92 days after she was impeached by Parliament on December 9th. The National Assembly had brought a total of 13 charges against the former president. The court summarized it into 4 areas during its ruling. The court dismissed charges such as Park's abuse of power, infringing on the freedom of the press, and dereliction of duty during the Sewol-ho ferry sinking. But it acknowledged Park's abuse of power in allowing her confidant Choi Soon-sil to meddle in state affairs. Most members of the public seemed to respect the court's decision. According to a poll carried out right after the court ruling, 9 out of 10 respondents said they supported the decision. But there were others who said they would not accept the results. Park supporters continued rallies against the decision, which later turned violent and even led to fatalities. Meanwhile, the impeachment quickly made headlines around the world. Some global outlets carried the live coverage of the ruling. The New York Times said it was a sign of how far South Korea's young democracy has evolved, as the former leader was removed without any violence after large, peaceful protests in recent months demanding her to step down. The BBC said while a new election could change the political landscape of South Korea, that society remains deeply divided. In an editorial, Japanese daily newspaper Asahi Shimbun said that President Park Geun-hye, whom the majority of the public was against, has been ousted, and further suggested that the urgent task at hand is to stabilize state affairs. People's reactions to the ouster remain mixed, but all will likely agree that this political event will be remembered in Korea's history. Right, so did you believe that she would be impeached? We'll start with you, Frank.
Yes, I thought she was going to be impeached. I think that's reflected in what I did that day. I went to the pro-Park demonstration first, knowing that after the impeachment, I would want a soundbite, an interview from somebody from the side that really sort of, I guess, won in this case. And I felt that it would be, maybe not a good place to be on that side. And I moved into the pro-impeachment side, the anti-Park side, and covered it from there. I felt that she was going to be impeached, and I thought that really the demonstrations were pivotal in securing that impeachment. Over the past 4 months, hundreds of thousands, at times millions of people coming out in the streets to demonstrate for her removal. I think that was instrumental. Without that, Park Geun-hye would not have been impeached. She would still be the president of South Korea.
And we should point out that, even though we're talking about having two camps here, that there is a pro-Park and an anti-Park side, these camps aren't even. Public opinion polls show that as many as 80% of Koreans support the removal of Park Geun-hye and supported the removal of Park Geun-hye. So while there was a very vocal crowd of her supporters, that makes up a very small population. The only age group decade in which it was close was 60 and up. But even then, it was something like 50 to 39% in favor of her removal.
But I was a little surprised to see that a lot of Koreans actually, even though they supported her removal, didn't seem to believe that it would actually happen. I mean, I spoke to some Koreans who didn't think she would be impeached, even though they hoped that she would be. And I spoke to employees at a workplace in Seoul that has both Korean workers and foreign employees, and they did a sort of a vote. So they asked everybody at the office who thought that Park Geun-hye would be impeached. And it was split down the middle, and all the foreigners thought that she would definitely be impeached, but most of the Koreans thought that she wouldn't be, which was very surprising to me because most of the reporters I've been talking to seem to be very sure that she would be impeached.
In a lot of ways, that's actually the most interesting part of this story. It's the deep-seated cynicism in institutions of power among the Korean public. That is, we saw this during the MERS crisis, we saw this following Sewol after it became politicized, that Koreans, modern Koreans today, as we've been here over the last couple of years, really have such a fundamental distrust of government and business and big business, and believe that they tend to be colluded and that there are people who are above the law. And I think that speaks to the belief that Park Geun-hye would not be removed, because there was just a belief that, she's so powerful and she's so tied in with the sort of gates of power, like the chaebol, that she couldn't possibly go down. So it was really a jubilant and extraordinary moment to be in Korea for this, because even Koreans were quite surprised.
Right. Elise, how do you respond to the reality that it was a unanimous vote by the Constitutional Court?
That certainly made it a more powerful decision, right? Because as was noted in the lead up to the ruling, so many of the people, the justices on the panel, were actually Park appointees. That it was unanimous, I think, is a huge blow to Park. There are reports that she herself was quite surprised by this. And because, as we saw, it took her 2 days to actually move out of the Blue House following the ruling, it seems that she made no preparations for the possibility that she might get thrown out, which I found was very surprising, because at best, her chances were 50-50.
Do you believe that the former leader, Park Geun-hye, had the opportunity to opt for a different ending to this scandal if she had taken a different approach earlier on?
She could have resigned. I mean, Nixon resigned. He took a high road out of there. She's not taking the high road, and I think that she's, in a way, endangering things here in South Korea by not accepting the results of this Constitutional Court decision, and perhaps imperiling her own self in terms of being prosecuted. The prosecutors are going to go after her harder because she hasn't accepted any responsibility here, and public sentiment actually as well is going to be harsher toward her because she hasn't accepted responsibility and accepted the verdict of the Constitutional Court.
I agree. I think a lot of people was hoping that she would have done a better job at not only accepting the verdict, but also trying to calm down her supporters, even after the violent protests on Friday and 3 people dying. I think a lot of people was hoping that she would have acted more as a sort of a statement and trying to calm everybody down instead of adding more fuel to the fire by saying she's not accepting the verdict.
Yeah, the biggest criticism of Park Geun-hye over the tenure of her presidency and then since the scandal broke is that she is arrogant and aloof to the needs of the people, that she thinks only of herself and not the people. And she did nothing to change that perception. In fact, she only sort of doubled down on the appearance of arrogance, right? In not sort of testifying when asked, not being questioned when asked, refusing to let investigators into the Blue House. So she only continued to underline the public perception of her, which is that she believes that she's really more an imperial leader rather than somebody who is elected by the people.
The fact that Park Geun-hye refused to testify, refused to answer prosecutors' questions, certainly influenced the Constitutional Court decision.
피청구인은 최서원의 국정 개입 사실을 철저히 숨겼고 검찰과 특별검사의 조사에 응하지 않았고 청와대에 대한 압수수색도 거부하였습니다. 피청구인의 일련의 언행을 보면 법 위배 행위가 반복되지 않도록 하여야 할 헌법 수호 의지가 드러나지 않습니다.
And I think that could also harm her moving forward in terms of potential indictment.
Right. Upon returning to her private residence, the former leader, speaking through a spokesperson, claimed that the truth will be revealed.
시간이 걸리겠지만 진실은 반드시 밝혀진다고 믿고 있습니다.
This is probably why, Marcus, you mentioned her not accepting the verdict. What are your thoughts on these words? How do you interpret them?
So I can tell you that the public isn't interpreting them very well. There's a lot of criticism of this notion that the truth will come out because it makes it seem as if there's more to the story that she somehow hasn't presented in all these months that she's been able to present, but also a lack of sort of culpability or taking culpability for all of this. But you could make the case that because she is likely to face more investigation, if not indictment, in the coming weeks and months ahead, that she has to be careful and has to sort of parse what she says. And so it is completely plausible that had she taken more responsibility or accepted the full verdict and said that very clearly, then that could be used against her in court.
In this next report, we walk through the former leader's leadership, starting from her inauguration to her impeachment, a journey that has had its fair share of ups and downs, to say the least. Korea's first female president, its first unmarried president, its first father and daughter president, and the country's first impeached president. All things former President Park Geun-hye will be remembered for. On February 25th, 2013, Park Geun-hye was sworn into office as the 18th President of Korea, promising to open a new era of happiness. But during her 4 years and 14 days in office, Park faced many difficulties. In April 2014, the Sewol-ho ferry accident took place, and the most tragic event under the Park administration, which exposed the government's failures in dealings with large-scale emergencies. In November 2014, presidential documents alleging Chung Eun-hye's interference in state affairs were leaked, considered a prelude to the Choi Soon-sil scandal. In December 2015, Seoul and Tokyo concluded an agreement on the issue of wartime sexual slavery, but it was pushed through without consulting the victims. For each major incident, the Park administration was labeled lacking in communication and incompetent, leading to public discontent. Then, in September 2016, allegations surfaced about two foundations, Mir and K Sports, which were said to be established to promote the field of culture and sports. The person said to be controlling the two organizations, known as Choi Soon-sil, came to be at the center of attention. As a friend of former President Park for 40 years, Choi was accused of pressuring the heads of Korean conglomerates to make donations to her foundations. In October, Choi Soon-sil's tablet PC that contained numerous presidential documents was revealed to the public, adding to claims that Choi was heavily involved in influence-peddling.
일부 연설물이나 홍보물도 같은 맥락에서 표현 등에서 도움을 받은 적이 있습니다.
Allegations of forced donations to the two foundations and abuse of power by Choi Soon-sil and others eventually led to the former president being named a criminal suspect. This all led to the parliament's impeachment of the president on December 9th.
대통령 박근혜 탄핵 소추안은 파결되었음을 선포합니다.
3 months later, on March 10th, 2017, the Constitutional Court upheld the impeachment motion ousting President Park Geun-hye from office. Some describe the former leader, Park Geun-hye, as an incompetent leader, a stubborn person. What are your thoughts, Frank?
I think that's accurate. I think, one of the problems that we see with politics around the world is that it's a populist enterprise. The reason Park Geun-hye became president is because of the Saenuri party felt that name recognition would get her elected. That's why she became leader and their candidate. That's why Donald Trump became president of the United States. It was a populist enterprise. That's why Justin Trudeau is the Prime Minister of Canada, because of his association with our previous great Prime Minister, his father. Well, I really feel that was demonstrated here. The best person of the Saenuri party, perhaps the most capable leader, was not the candidate, because politics is a populist enterprise. It's funny, that's something that I think a friend of mine learned when his son was running for his class presidency. He gave a great speech, and then the taller, more handsome young man said, "Vote for me." And the taller, handsome young man won.
Oh, I see, okay. Oh, Elise, the former leader, Park Geun-hye, she allowed a friend, Choi Soon-sil, to play a role in helping her appoint officials, to even choosing her clothes. What does this tell you about the person, Park Geun-hye?
Well, there's different people who are going to read it different ways. I don't think that it's bad to have advisors. Everybody has advisors. They tend, at the government level, to be official. So they're either appointed or elected or have some sort of credentials to allow them to be advisors. The problem with the Choi Soon-sil influence was that it was so deliberately kept a secret that we're now finding out that they had like secret cell phones to talk to one another, that we're now finding out that Choi Soon-sil was able to install appointees that were her friends and personal trainers and whatnot, and that Choi Soon-sil had such unobstructed power when it came to policy decisions that really should be the purview of people with more credentials and experience.
In the West, we would call it a kitchen cabinet. Somebody that you sit around the coffee table with and talk about your day and how things are going as president. Somebody that can be really an informal advisor and a friend. I think everybody needs that in their work. Somebody outside of officialdom. The thing that happened, though, as Elise mentioned, is Choi Soon-sil vastly overstepped that to the point where she was ordering around presidential aides.
And it also became, I think it became such a big scandal because so little was known about Park Geun-hye's personal life to begin with. I remember I did, before all of this started, in early October last year, I did a profile of Park Geun-hye because the Danish Prime Minister was visiting Korea and he was paying a visit to Park Geun-hye in the Blue House. So I thought I would do a profile of the President of South Korea. And I was looking around for personal information on her and I couldn't find any. All I could find was really banal things like that she liked animals, she has dogs, but everybody likes animals, and that she was interested in French culture because she'd studied in France, but who doesn't like French culture? And that's it, and I was really surprised by that. Her very private persona became a problem for her during this crisis.
Right. Politics aside, President Park Geun-hye, the former president, she also suffered a lot of personal losses. She lost both her parents at an early age, both to assassinations. Does that make you regard her differently?
It certainly made the South Korean public regard her differently. I mean, because she was seen as a tragic figure and she had to sort of step in and be the unofficial first lady of the country. And so that explains some of the, nostalgia for her and the nostalgia for her father. But I think that now that several generations have passed since the 1970s, that the younger voters and the younger demographic groups can separate the fondness for her father and what he did for the economy from who Park is, which is her own individual person with her own individual agency who could have made her own individual decisions. And something we haven't even mentioned is this collusion or perceived alleged collusion between government and business, which is a pervasive problem in South Korea. And Choi Soon-sil was essentially able to exploit that, right, by running her own nonprofits that were essentially slush funds.
Right. And speaking about that, do you see this impeachment as serving to perhaps foster more transparency in dealings between politicians and heads of conglomerates in the future?
I think it depends on how long the 30 people that are indicted go to jail and whether Park Geun-hye is indicted and serves time. One characteristic of Koreans that I would like to see change is I'd like them to become more intolerant. I think Koreans are incredibly tolerant. When somebody shoves you on the subway, nobody says, "Hey, this is one of those times." The behavior of Park Geun-hye when Koreans are saying, "Hey, you can't do that." And I think that, you know, the judiciary has to hand out sentences, and those sentences need to be served, not commuted or pardoned. And that will send the signal to business and to government that times have changed and things can't go on as they have before. And then you'll see that change in behavior and more transparency between government and big business here.
Some of the conglomerates now are trying to signal that they want to cut some of their political ties. You have companies like Hyundai and LG and SK who are now don't want to be a part of the FKI, the Federation of Korean Industries anymore. So they're trying to say they want to limit their political influence. Whether that's a real intention of the big conglomerates remains to be seen, of course. But there is some positive developments right now, I think.
And Samsung also dissolved its future strategy group, which I think was a whole building of executives. So I think, again, as Marcus said, that efforts are being made, and hopefully after the indictments, maybe this is to kind of forestall the punishments that might be levied to those executives. But after these indictments and these trials are finished, hopefully we'll see the same type of behavior.
Right. Now, as seen in the report, aside from the Choi Soon-sil scandal, the former leader was also involved in controversy regarding her responses to several domestic challenges, including the MERS that Elise mentioned, as well as the Sewol ferry disaster. What, in your opinion, was her biggest failure?
Her failure to respond to the Sewol ferry disaster, I think, was seen in the public here in Korea as her biggest failure. Also, the blacklisting of Korean artists done by members of her government is something that's very hard to defend, I think, in an open, modern democracy. So that's probably some of the major failings, I'd say.
I wouldn't pick one domestic failing. Instead, I would pick that she had 4 years out of a 5-year term to make a difference and to have a legacy, have some sort of policy legacy as a leader, and squandered those years. She was elected on promises to reform the pension system, for example, to help senior citizens, to help young people and the large sort of inequality gap in this country. None of those things. There's also a major environmental crisis in South Korea. The pollution levels are quite bad. There are so many various challenges and fronts where she could have decided to take some leadership, and I don't know what she did with the last 4 years besides take a lot of foreign trips. And that's one of the criticisms of Park Geun-hye, that she was constantly getting on a plane to go meet with the leader of Colombia or the leader of Liechtenstein or whatever. But there are still many problems at home that could have been addressed over the past 4 years that have now just been kicked to the next leader, which is going to be more challenging for him or her.
Yes, and coming in, she mentioned, one of her campaign promises was concerned to economic democratization. I remember that term. And that was perhaps one of the first campaign promises that was, as Elise mentioned, kicked to the curb. And, in terms of her biggest failings, I think Marcus nailed it there. The Sewol ferry, nobody will ever forget that. Missing 7 hours, just that phrase, missing 7 hours, to be missing for that period of time. I remember George W. Bush talking about 9/11, and he said he wanted to go in front of the American public as soon as possible. Other officials were preventing him from it. He wanted to go in front of them as soon as possible, and that's something that Park Geun-hye should have done as soon as possible, at least by noon that day, and not waited and had her hair done and everything else that she did that day, instead of appear in front of the South Korean people, just to reassure people. It's not that she could have saved anybody. She probably, none of her behavior perhaps would have saved anybody that day, but it would have at least reassured people that the government was doing its utmost to try to save some of the people that unfortunately perished.
Right. Okay, before we go then, as always, a question on how you assess today's discussion. Marcus, I'll give the question to you because you were not here last week.
This is a very, very interesting topic, and it's something that I think we all have a lot on our minds. So it's been good to talk not only about the legacy of Park Geun-hye, but also about what comes next, which is going to be very interesting to see.
Right. On the day of the verdict, Acting Chief Justice Lee Jung-mi expressed hopes for the ruling to serve as a stepping stone to a path of healing and unity away from division and chaos. Indeed, let's hope that now can be a time for Korea to let it all go and start afresh. Thank you for watching.